Open the file and the tone changes. This isn't theory. It's a schedule. At the top, a header that would look mundane anywhere else. Crew rotation wardroom. Below it, call signs that shouldn't share a page with altitude, N/A. Wardroom. Bosun. Keel. The kind of names you stencil on a locker that smells like diesel and salt. Only the next column lists NTW nodes, and the coordinates don't belong to any ocean. They line up with orbital regimes radio amateurs know by heart, and which McKinnon's claims hinted at with those fleet-to-fleet transfers. Stakes sit between the lines. If this is operational, then people are living up there for half a year at a time. Families on the ground think their kid took a fellowship. In this ledger, that fellowship is a 180-day tour between waypoints that never touch down. You don't assign 27 to 39-year-olds to 6-month cycles if you're testing. You do it when a presence has to be sustained, even when the sun makes communication bleed. Action runs on timestamps. NTW3, NTW5, a note, elliptical SK above geo ring. Station keeping, not a flyby, not a pass. Holding, the maintenance entries read dark pass prep, then list windows that snake around solar cycle 25's loudest days. Every third line, a board on NTL7 drift, like a mantra to keep you honest when the background rises and the handshake won't hold. Next to it, a return key, 2026 scrawl that bleeds through red like someone pressed too hard with the grease pencil. Now the human angle. Crew ages cluster, 27 to 39. It's a sweet spot, young enough to recover, old enough to have steady baselines. Next column, maternal line match, verified. 8 out of 10 rows tagged yes. Alpha M isn't a rumor in this document, it's a staffing constraint. A single asterisk beside one name notes provisional, pending vestibular gate retest. The following month, that name disappears from the rotation and reappears in a maintenance memo as a consultant. That isn't a demotion, it's a compromise, keep the brain, pull the body off the seat. There's a scribble I can't shake, between nights. It shows up on a birthday card text dropped into the manifest as a morale note. We cut cake between nights. It says in cramped handwriting, I'll owe you too. Someone taped that into a duty log. You don't fake that sort of thing for effect. You stick it there because a crew chief wanted whoever filed the next watch to remember there was a person in the seat the last time the panel flickered. Parallel to the crew blocks, a column titled Fleet-to-Fleet Transfer Auth uses a code that feels familiar. If you've ever heard Gary McKinnon's account of non-terrestrial officers and fleet-to-fleet transfers, this is where your chest tightens. The manifest transfer codes marry naval grammar to off-planet logistics, keel to wardroom, payload handoff in dark. Not a resupply truck. A handover between platforms with no runway. The ships McKinnon claimed were named with admirals don't appear here, but the structure, officer billets attached to non-terrestrial positions, transfers authorized like you'd move a petty officer between destroyers, echoes too neatly to call coincidence and walk away. Maintenance cycles tell their own story. Radiative skin check, post-loiter, followed by emissivity targets that line up with the Hangar 12 logs. Cold sink cycle verify, panels 4 to 9. Again echoing inland thermal curves that go colder after long holds. And tucked in the bottom corner, a line item. Interface calibration, HRV matched to carrier. That's our cockpit note from the medical file, living here as a pre-deployment checklist. If the pilot's rhythm won't lock to the lattice before the window, the seat stays cold and the tour's reassigned. Meanwhile, something else was happening in the timing. Dark pass, windows tilt toward those predicted quiet pockets inside solar cycle 25. It isn't that they avoid the peak, they thread it. Signal hygiene appears in a comment. Bubble, an old radio hands phrase for living with noise by timing your whisper. On 2 missed windows from prior cycles, the margin reads, no authorization, maintain loiter. If someone's waiting on a countersign from outside, this is where you see the patience grinding people down. There's a section labeled Custodial Oversight, Maritime. It doesn't belong on a flight manifest. It lists a countersign requirement next to a stylized crest you'd expect on maritime insurance paperwork, not orbital ops. The initials match the contract's authority block. Under that crest, Control Interface Seizure Clause on violation. You don't threaten to seize what you don't already partly own. The crews serve tours. The interface's answer to a different key. In the margins, personal notes keep catching. A line, wardroom coffee ration extended morale. Another, bosun reports whale song under slab during pre-flight. It's the same tone drivers heard at the inland dry dock when the floor hummed at midnight. Humor tries to live here. Stars that don't drift, 2 counted over basin, tell comms we named them. The reply days later, names denied. Someone draws 2 tiny asterisks anyway. You can feel the delayed disclosure, little human scrawls hinting at a bigger map you're not supposed to see yet. Impact lands late but hard. You add the 180-day rotations, the Alfram verification, the fleet transfer authorizations, the maintenance built for loiter, the dark pass choreography, the custodial crest, and that red-circled 2026 return key, and a picture forms. Not a myth, a calendar, a crew life, a legal leash, and a clock nobody in the wardroom controls that says if you miss November 12th, 2026, the key turns somewhere else, and the interface you sit and recognize as a different hand. One last micro-story. A junior ops officer writes a note to their sister. "I'll be late to the wedding," they say. "Tell Dad the sea has 2 skies, I'm learning the second." It's a line that shows up again years later in a Senate staffer's resignation letter. "I was told the Navy has 2 skies." When the same phrase walks through separate rooms, you don't ignore it. You follow it to the clause that makes everyone nervous, and the window the sun will only grant once before it slams shut for another 11 years. Contract 2026, the clause with a dead man's signature. We lay the contract flat and let the language do the talking. Activation on receipt of return key event, not to exceed Q4 2026. That's not a goal, that's a fuse. Then, indemnity for extraterritorial engagement and non-state contact protocols. The phrasing feels maritime, Admiralty law bled into orbit. A subheading reads Custodial Oversight, Maritime, followed by a crest you'd expect on a maritime insurer's letterhead, not an aerospace file. Under it sits the teeth. Violation triggers seizure of control interfaces. You don't threaten seizure unless you can enforce it. The signature block shouldn't exist. The name belongs to an admiral whose death certificate sits in a 190 SAXS county archive. Yet the initials ride the page exactly like a 1981 memo we already cross-matched. Same stroke pattern, same rushed tick on the last letter. Forensics in our packet say the ink's age tracks 4 decades in storage. The paper stock pegs to a government printing office lot used in the early Reagan years. Either someone with era-specific gear built a forgery that fools both chemistry and custody, or the signature isn't about a living hand. It's about an authority that outlived the signer. There are 3 plausible paths. 1. Misfiled identity. A namesake slipped through a bureaucratic crack and wore a dead man's shadow. 2. Ghost authoring. An office used the Admiral's stamp as a legacy instrument long after his funeral, like old notary seals that keep circulating inside a closed fraternity. 3. Legacy authority. A custodial framework empowered an office, not a person, to bind programs across decades, and the Admiral's sign was the mask the office wore. In all 3, the point is the same: continuity outside the normal chain of command. A sidebar labeled countersign requirements is the hinge. The countersign is maritime. The crest matches the insurer's mark we saw on the manifest's oversight line. Below it, the clause every operator dreads. Interfaces are property of custodial trust. Operational use licensed under conditions enumerated herein. The fleet you think you built. Legally it's leased. The return key isn't just a signal window. It's the moment the license renews or reverts. Miss the window, and the trust seizes the keys. The vocabulary aligns with earlier memos in a way that makes copy-paste unlikely. Return key, NTL7 background. Phase alignment, dark pass. Terms sprinkled across separate artifacts converge here without a style mismatch. That's what you look for when you test provenance. Shared jargon without editorial drift. The contract's footnotes even cite a blue Custodial Authority Guidance Series by number, the same family of numbers we saw redacted in logistics ledgers funding inland dry docks. The roads keep meeting. Meanwhile, something else was happening in the enforcement paragraph. Extraterritorial engagement isn't a chest-thumping phrase about foreign soil. It's about jurisdiction when your ship lives between nights. It provides a shield against terrestrial courts and a bridge to a maritime custodian that treats orbit like another ocean. The kicker, non-state contact protocols. You could stretch that to mean contractors. You could, but nestled beside custodial countersign, the implication leans heavier, contact bounded by an authority that isn't strictly national. The 2026 not to exceed date isn't arbitrary. The scheduling appendix ties activation to return key window attainment under NTL7, which we've already traced to quiet pockets inside solar cycle 25. The clause doesn't ask for launch, it asks for handshake. Activation on receipt means the flip gets thrown when the window opens and the countersign arrives. If no countersign, maintain loiter, reattempt in next qualifying window. The penalty provisions don't wait 11 years. They float. On repeated non-fulfillment, custodial trust may exercise interface seizure. The trust holds leverage patients can't blunt. We need to talk about Ben Rich. People argue about the exact words, but the spirit of his late life remark hangs over this page. We already have the means locked up in black projects. Lock implies a key holder. This contract names one, not a person, a trust, with a maritime crest and seizure rights. When you put Rich's warning next to a lease on control interfaces, the silhouette sharpens. The tech is locked. The key isn't ours alone. There's a human echo buried in a compliance note. Crew selection shall comply with medical interface specifications. Deviations require custodial waiver. That's Alphium codified. Even the body becomes subject to lease terms. A separate page addresses family communications morale, as if to remind counsel that behind clauses and countersigns, people bake cakes between nights. Forensics keep batting down easy outs. The metadata on the scan shows pre-200S OCR artifacts consistent with naval office equipment. Curled baseline, misread ligatures, the same glitches our manifest carries. The page numbers use a contractor's template we saw on the medical protocol. Cross-document pen pressure analysis matches initials across 3 signatures, and the oxidation on the ink reads time, not artifice. Chain of custody still gapes, but to fake this you'd need a time machine and a payroll for ghosts. Impact then, a countdown anchored to the sun, a license bound to a maritime custodian, a fleet built inland and spoken of like ships, pilots selected by a gate their mothers gave them, and a dead admiral's hand, or what it represents, holding a pen that writes across decades. If you've been wondering who could carry a clock from the 198s to a November night in 2026 without dropping a second, the answer sits in the countersign. A program behind the program, the custodians kept time. Now we follow their trail. The custodians, the program behind the program. While the contract spelled out teeth, the countersign gave the teeth a body. Follow that crest, and you land in a corridor nobody campaigns on, Blue Custodial Authority. The phrase appears in redacted briefs that never say DoD or NASA. They say Guidance Series, Blue Custodial, then list numbers like waypoints, BC12, BC17. The logistics ledgers that funded desert, dry docks cite those numbers as justification for payments routed through a foundation whose endowments read maritime. Lighthouses, sea scholarships, merchant seaman memorials. On paper, benevolence. In practice, a sluice gate moving titanium and composite by the truckload. Exactly the kind of procurement anomaly that outstripped known shuttle needs in the 1980s. Stakes surface fast. If Blue Custodial isn't an agency but a trust, then elected oversight never held the wheel. The people who sign the checks sit in boardrooms, not hearings. Families who ask where their kid went get a form letter stamped with a maritime exemption about national sea lanes, even when the nearest tide is 1,000 miles away. A 200 Senate inquiry tried to pry at the funding. The transcript pivots on one phrase, sea lanes. The moment counsel invokes it, the hearing moves in camera and never reopens. Action looks like camouflage by familiarity. Training hubs for the program nest inside anti-submarine schools. Class schedules list acoustic analysis on one line and phase stability on the next, as if you teach torpedo evasion and non-inertial interface calibration in the same breath. The language crossover isn't accidental. Navy culture knows pickets, wardrooms, dark passes, and quiet windows. Shift the medium from water to sky, and the grammar still holds. A junior officer salutes an empty chair before briefing, not because they're superstitious, but because the seat belongs to a flag who never appears on rosters and whose authority rides in on blue custodial letterhead. Meanwhile, something else was happening in money's shadow. The inland hangar's utility bills weren't paid by a defense line item. They cleared through a foundation's research pond budget. Truck manifests for marine-grade composites bore a shipyard code repurposed for a salt flat. The insurer's crest from the contract reappears on a risk assessment for extraterritorial conveyance, as if orbit were just another shipping lane that needed actuarial tables and salvage clauses. One memo uses a word nobody at NASA writes, general average. A maritime doctrine where everyone with cargo on a ship shares the loss if cutting weight saves the vessel. Apply that logic to a fleet between nights, and you get why a seizure of control interfaces feels normal to the people holding the countersign. Human angles keep finding cracks. An aide to a coastal senator quits after a briefing and scribbles a line on a napkin. I was told the Navy has two skies. The staff whisper lingers because it matches what a junior ops officer wrote to their sister and what a recruit heard from a nurse. When separate rooms repeat the same odd sentence, you're not hearing poetry. You're hearing doctrine slipping out of a compartment. Impact shows up where accountability should. If Blue Custodial owns the interfaces as trust property and leases operational use under conditions, then the chain of command in a crisis jogs sideways. A mishap on a dark pass doesn't march straight to JAG. It detours through a maritime custodian with seizure rights and non-state contact protocols. That's how a dead admiral's signature can still carry weight. Authority is stamped into a framework, not a person. Continuity of command becomes continuity of contract. Complications sharpen in personnel files. Deference patterns cluster around an office labeled A/Blue. Orders arrive with naval cadence decades out of date. The voice in a leaked briefing speaking like the 197s never ended. A retired flag acting under custodial proxy? The trend lines point that way. It's not nostalgia. It's an anchor. You keep culture steady when the medium changes by planting an old keel in a new hull and calling it A/Blue. There's one more paper echo. A 198's GPO lot number from the contract's stock resurfaces on blue custodial guidance sheets. Same watermark filament count, same batch. Forensics say that doesn't happen by accident across decades unless a single supply chain stayed in-house. If you're trying to fake this, you don't invent the watermark filament count nobody checks. If you're running it, you do, because small consistencies keep your compartments aligned. So who are the custodians? Not aliens, not caped councils, just a private public braid old navies understand. A maritime trust with insurer logic, a board that treats orbit like a sea, and a cadre of officers seconded to a sky the public doesn't admit exists. They pay for docks and deserts, fold recruits into wellness checks, and time activations to quiet pockets the sun affords. They don't write op-eds. They write lease terms. And in November 2026, if the countersign arrives on NTL7, they expect the return key to turn because they built the lock, trained the hands, and own the interface the hand will touch. The return key, solar cycle, and the signal window. While A/Blue kept culture steady, and the custodians held the lease, the sky itself set the tempo. The manifest's red scrawl, 2026, return key, wasn't superstition. It pointed to a slot the sun rarely grants. A narrow pocket inside the roar of Solar Cycle 25 when signal hygiene finally beats the noise. Stakes first. If the fleet's legal use depends on a countersign, and that countersign rides a fragile frequency that hates static, then families aren't waiting on a launch, they're waiting on quiet. Miss the pocket and every wellness check becomes a calendar error. Seats stay cold, leases sour, seizure clauses step forward. It's not a drama beat, it's contract enforcement measured in sunspots. Action sits in the notes the manifest barely hides. Solar activity runs on an 11-year rhythm. Peaks make engineers curse, charged particles flood space, ionospheric layers churn, HF bands snap like wet rope. But amid the storm, there are eddies, brief dips where the background softens and a whisper slides through. Solar Cycle 25's predicted peak in late 2025 through 2026 is textbook for this pattern. The technical memo taped to the back of the crew schedule calls it NTL7 background, with a handwritten ad. Phase alignment achieved when background equals NTL7 threshold. The math isn't elegant prose. It's thresholds and margins, the way sonar techs mark a moment when the ocean goes still enough to hear a screw turn. Meanwhile, something else was happening in the archives. Two prior cycles show windows that came and went, late 1990s, early 2010s. The logs mark them with the same precision. Quiet pockets inside peak, duration 9 to 14 minutes, repeat 27 days. Next to each, a phrase that chews morale. No authorization. The fleet loitered. Crews trained. The countersign never arrived. Maybe the net on the other side wasn't ready. Maybe the custodians withheld. Either way, the return key didn't turn, and the clause slid forward 11 years like a tide. Here's where radio hands nod. In storms, you don't fight noise with power, you wait for phase. The memo diagrams a carrier nested inside layered interference, then circles a path where pilot HRV coherence. The same lock the medical file prized. Helps the interface discriminate signal from background. It's a paired dance. Sun's background drops to NTL7. Pilot locks heartbeat to lattice. Interface finds phase. Handshake completes. Pull any leg. No quiet pocket, no coherence, no lattice. And the key hits brass and won't seat. There's a scheduling page that reads like a chaplain's calendar. Dark passes. Those long, silent holds. Stack along predicted quiet pockets starting Q3 2025. Fattening into late 2025 and early 2026, then tapering. Calibration blocks snap to those dates. Crews sit in seats built to drink heat and wait for a carrier to clear its throat. The caution lines multiply. Abort on NTL7 drift. Maintain loiter on no auth. Do not consume return key window for test traffic. In plain speech, don't waste the one breath we might get on chatter. A microstory rides the margin. We held 10 minutes in dark, comms said. Not yet. Felt like a church where nobody lights the candle. You can hear the restraint in that line. The tech is ready. The bodies are ready. The law is waiting. The sky alone decides. Meanwhile, the ground preps and whispers. Airspace notices masquerade as balloon studies, closing corridors and coastal arcs that line up with the inland docks hum cycles. Power companies file routine maintenance notices that coincide with predicted pockets. A weather station near the Salt Flat starts recording low-frequency anomalies, subtle, regular. Just before dawn on days the memo highlights in yellow. None of it says activation. All of it says timing. There's a chart with colored bands that looks innocent until you read the legend. Orange, predicted solar maxima turbulence. Pale blue, historical quiet eddies inside maxima. Green hash, NTL7 attainment probability greater than 0.6. Across Q4 2026, 3 green hashes sit like stones you hop across a creek on. Next to each an operations note. Crew rest advanced, interface pre-bias, custodial liaison on hotline. You don't stage that much choreography for a rumor. What nobody in the wardroom can fix is the part that lives outside the hull. The countersign. The contract says activation on receipt of return key event. Then ties event to both NTL7 and a custodial countersign. If one arrives without the other, nothing flips. That's why the prior cycles cut so deep. The sun did its part, the countersign stayed dark. The manifest answers that with patience and a threat. On repeated non-fulfillment, custodial trust may exercise interface seizure. It's the quietest hardball you'll ever read. Now the human hinge. The same biology that puts a pilot in the seat becomes part of the signal chain. Heart rate variability, the tiny accelerations and decelerations between beats, has a frequency content that shifts with breath and stress. The interface looks for a band that matches the lattice carrier when NTL7 drops. A calm pilot isn't just nice to have, they're a filter. That's why crew psychologists brief coherence holds like their weapons checks. It's not meditation class, it's comms discipline with your own body. In the aftermath of missed windows, the memos get terse. Maintain loiter. Do not burn cold sink budget. The cost of waiting is material. Panels age, seals fatigue, titanium remembers every thermal breath. But the cost of rushing is worse. Burn a pocket on garbage traffic, and you buy 11 years of silence with a single mistake. The return key clause was written by people who sailed in storms. They knew when not to shout. So we arrive at the date stamped in ink that chemistry says is old. November 12, 2026. Not mystical. Probabilistic. A green hash with a custody clock behind it. Families won't see a rocket. They'll see wellness checks, per diem envelopes, and a sky that hums lower than usual. And somewhere above the basin, 2 rhythms, one from a star, the interface chest.